I promised to speak about Abraham Lincoln a little bit today. And according to his biographers, Abraham Lincoln, who was assassinated 150 years ago this month, Lincoln was well known for his magnanimous and his generous spirit. As a young attorney, he often represented indigents, and on many occasions he charged less than was typical for legal services. Although hardly a wealthy man, Lincoln donated money routinely to those who were ill, disabled, or facing financial difficulties. And as president, Lincoln was equally generous, often granting pardons to AWOL soldiers who otherwise would have faced severe punishment. On one notable occasion, he was moved by the entreaties of a mother and the wife of a man who had been imprisoned for draft dodging. And when the two women had left his office with a promise that he would grant a pardon to this particular man, Lincoln's good friend, William Speed, said, "Lincoln, with my knowledge of your nervous sensibilities, it's a wonder that such scenes as these don't kill you." And in reply, Lincoln admitted to not being emotionally sound, but he continued, "What you have just witnessed is the only thing that I have done today that has given me the slightest pleasure." And Speed, he added, "die when I may, I want it said of me by those who knew me best that I always plucked a thistle and planted a flower where I thought that a flower would grow." The closing paragraph of Lincoln's second inaugural address, notable for its brevity as well as its eloquence, reflected this sensitive man's ardent wish for the reconciliation of the northern and southern states. Lincoln spoke in the second inaugural of binding wounds, of caring for the widow and the orphan, and of course, treating the defeated with charity. Few presidents before or after have demonstrated as benevolent a spirit as Abraham Lincoln, and yet he was also the man who used the authority of his high office to enter into and to persevere in a conflict that eventually would claim the lives of over 600,000 combatants, that would wound 500,000 more, figures that nearly match those of all our country's other wars combined. One can hardly imagine what it must have been like to experience such a profound degree of cognitive dissonance. The word charity, as it is commonly used today, hardly seems to do justice to a man of Lincoln's stature. Most of us as Americans undoubtedly feel an obligation to make modest donations to worthy causes that we call charities, and if we are in a position to itemize, to then deduct those amounts from our taxable income. Behaving in a charitable manner toward others, that's also an ethos that many of us try on a daily basis to uphold. As an example of the latter, an article appeared in one of Madison's newspapers a few months ago, and it was entitled, "Snow Removal Acts of Kindness." The author of this article showcased several vigorous young citizens who rise early after each snowfall, clear their own sidewalks and driveways, and then move on to other properties in the neighborhood. One such benefactor in Madison, who had older neighbors, said, quote, "Shoveling for others is a responsibility all young homeowners should feel good about. It does not appear that the beneficiaries of this service request such assistance from their neighbors. The shovel wielders merely do this job on their own because it strikes them as just the right and the kindly thing to do." Now, people perform random acts of charity in many other ways. They pay the toll for the car behind them on the expressway. They help an elder to load groceries into his or her car. They give up their seat on the bus to someone who seems to need to rest their feet. And such simple gestures are, of course, important because they do help to build social capital and reinforce our collective sense of solidarity. A rather amusing example of this was shared by Richard Herman in explaining why he likes to live in a small town. And I'm talking here about a town that's much smaller than Fond du Lac. One morning, Richard Herman says, his mother borrowed his pickup truck to go into the small town to do some shopping. But Richard had left his fishing pole in the passenger seat alongside the driver's seat. And as his mother was turning a corner, the pole fell over and the hook got snagged in her collar. Unable to extract the hook in the truck, she walked into the store carrying the pole, seeking help from the elderly storekeeper. But he could not get the hook out either, so he offered instead to walk behind her, carrying the pole as she picked out her groceries. You just can't get service like that in the city, Richard says. Now, while all of this is quite lovely and also somewhat amusing, it doesn't really get, I believe, to the essence of charity. Charity is more than doing nice things for people on occasion or contributing to a few causes with which we happen to sympathize. Our English word charity comes from the Latin caris, which means dear, something that's dear to us. We act in a manner like this, a generous manner, because something is dear to us. The noun form of that Latin word, caritas, does literally translate as charity. And caritas appears numerous times in the Latin Bible, known as the Vulgate. But caritas and charity are themselves the translation of an earlier Greek word, agape, which the New Testament writers often used to denote a sacrificial kind of love, the kind of love that can transform our lives. And so, according to the Apostle Paul, of all the gifts of the Spirit, agape is the one that Christians should be the most eager to obtain. And now, faith, hope, and charity abide. These three. And the greatest of the three is charity. Agape describes God's regard for us as human beings. And God expects human beings to show the same sort of consideration toward each other. That's agape. Now, more recent editions of the English language Bible, those that have succeeded the King James, they have struck the word charity from the text and they have replaced it with the word love. Now, arguments can be made for either choice, charity or love. But the problem with love is that our English word lacks the precision of the Greek language in which the New Testament was originally composed. Because love for the Greeks could mean several things. It could mean eros, the passionate, carnal, romantic love that we celebrate on Valentine's Day and maybe on certain other occasions. Eros is never mentioned in the Greek New Testament for good reasons. Philia, that is love that binds siblings or close friends together. And that word philia is mentioned on several occasions in the Bible. Philia exists between and among kindred spirits, but it tends to exclude strangers or more casual acquaintances. Agape differs from both eros and philia because it is indiscriminate and disinterested. Agape rejects no one, and it expects nothing for itself. If you love those who love you, what merit is there in that? Jesus asks his followers in the Gospel of Luke. After all, even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who do good to you, is there any merit in that? After all, even sinners do as much. If you lend from those to those from whom you hope to gain, is there merit in any of that? Even sinners lend to sinners in order to get much in return. And so I say to you, Jesus continues, love your enemies, do good, lend without any thought for yourself. And that way you will be children of the Most High, who is generous to the ungrateful and to the wicked. And this is the kind of love that Abraham Lincoln had in mind with the war winding down, when he implored his fellow citizens to lay aside their hurts and their grievances and to act charitably toward their Confederate adversaries. But just as Jesus was crucified, Lincoln was soon assassinated, and the spirit of agape died with him. And instead, what happened? Retributive measures were adopted, and the wounds of the Civil War continued to fester. They fester to this very day. Agape differs from eros and philia in another important respect. The latter two, eros and philia, arise more or less spontaneously, effortlessly, as desire and affection. Eros and philia belong to us, we might say, as a natural endowment. Agape is different in that it requires intentionality and the application of a certain amount of willpower. It is something we must choose to practice and to prioritize. It is the kind of love that we have to learn, Arthur Foote writes. It's like a ladder that we spend our whole lifetime climbing, never quite managing to get to the very top. Now, that's not to say that agape is a sensibility that is entirely absent from us and from our basic human nature. Now, although, as Richard Dawkins says, we do possess, each and every one of us, this selfish gene that is linked to our own personal survival and to the continuation of our genetic inheritance, we are also born with the ability, in addition to this selfish gene, we are born with the ability to empathize. And so Buddhism teaches that human beings are intrinsically compassionate, each of us invested with the potential for exceptional kindness. But there is this tension between these two tendencies, which is something each of us has to contend with on a daily basis. And because so many forces and so much of our conditioning in our society pushes us toward self-interest, toward the manifestation of this selfish gene, it does oftentimes take a conscious effort to connect with that compassionate and loving side of ourselves. Eros and philia, they come easy. But thinking and acting charitably toward those with whom we have very little in common, or whose values are at variance with our own, that's a much greater challenge. But that is precisely what agape prescribes. For instance, I love Anne Lamott. And in one of her books, Anne Lamott describes the anger and the revulsion that she felt toward George W. Bush following the invasion in 2003 of Iraq. And having convinced herself that such angry sentiments were fully justified, Lamott was brought up short one Sunday morning in the Presbyterian church that she attends in Marin County. Love for one's enemies was the theme of that day's sermon. This drives me crazy, Lamott writes, that God seems to have no taste, no standards. And yet, she says, on most days, this is what gives any of us any hope at all. And so in the days and the weeks that followed the delivery of that sermon, Lamott does her best to adjust her attitude, to get past her distaste for his policies and to see that the president is just a flawed, struggling human being just like her or anybody else. On some days, she says, I am more successful than on other days. But she perseveres because she believes, as she puts it, that loving the people in this White House is the single most subversive position I could possibly take. Now, loving one's enemy does not mean acquiescing to their agenda. It does not mean excusing their behavior. It does not failing to hold offending parties accountable. But it does mean resisting the temptation to demonize. It means struggling to be patient rather than petulant, speaking and acting out of good rather than ill will. As the 14th century Flemish mystic John of Ruysbroek put it, a heart full of kindness is like a lamp full of precious oil. For the oil of mercy enlightens the erring sinner with good example, and the words and works of comfort it provides will anoint and heal those whose hearts are wounded or grieved or perplexed. And, he says, it is the fire and the light for those who dwell in the virtues, in the fire of charity. And neither jealousy nor envy can perturb it or put it out. Now, when I think of agape or charity as an active principle in today's world, the first thing that comes to mind is this idea of restorative justice. By bringing victims and perpetrators and other stakeholders together to discuss a crime and the impact, the harm that it has caused. By bringing these people together to have these kind of candid conversations in the restorative justice process, emotional healing is promoted. Painful residues of bitterness and shame are removed. Although restorative justice work can be extraordinarily uncomfortable for the participants, it does, experience has shown, it does awaken empathy and can help people to move toward forgiveness. Now, in Buddhism, we find a concept, bodhicitta, that is closely related to agape. Bodhicitta is a cognate of two Sanskrit words, bodhi, which simply means awake, and citta, which could either mean heart or mind. And Pema Chodron describes bodhicitta as a soft spot in our psyche, a vulnerable and tender place, which, she says, even the cruelest person alive possesses. And when we are open, and when we allow ourselves to be affected by someone else's suffering, we will initially feel this wave of sadness coming over us. But then on the other side of that sadness, there will be this profound, all-embracing compassion that begins to well up inside of us. And so she says that this bodhicitta, when it actualizes itself, can soften us when we are unkind, can humble us when we get a little bit too arrogant. Joanna Macy, who teaches in the Buddhist tradition, shared at one point memories of her work when she was much younger, some 50 years ago, her work with Tibetan refugees in northern India. And she says that during her service, she once encountered a Tibetan nun who shared with her the secret, her secret for developing greater compassion. And the nun said to Macy, "Remind yourself that over countless lifetimes, every sentient being has been your mother. View someone as your mother, someone caring for you, someone sacrificing for you, and your heart will begin to open toward them." Macy listened respectfully to this older Tibetan nun, but concluded that because at that point in her life she did not believe in reincarnation, the teaching simply didn't apply to her. But on the other hand, she would also feel herself feeling deeply troubled whenever she was walking in northern India on these steep paths, and she would see Indian laborers struggling under these heavy loads. And oftentimes she would turn away from these individuals, uncomfortable with the spectacle of suffering. But then one day, several days after she had listened to this nun, she observed a man stumbling and struggling under this huge tree trunk that he was carrying on his back. And she didn't turn away. She looked at him, and suddenly she said, "I felt the furniture in my mind being rearranged." The man ceased to become an abstraction. He ceased to become this faceless victim of a cruel, exploitative economic system. Now, he really was her mother. He was her child. And she felt this deep sense of kinship, of relationship. And then she said, from that time on, it did not matter whether I believed in reincarnation or not. Now, unfortunately, it is all too easy for us to do precisely what Macy did originally, which is to turn our back on the spectacle of misfortune and to rationalize our self-protective and ungenerous behavior. So another example, Alice. Alice was a woman living in Texas, and she to this day remains deeply troubled by her experience of the refugees who came to her community after Hurricane Katrina had destroyed their neighborhoods in New Orleans. And initially, Alice writes, when these refugees appeared in her town, she tried to be supportive. She would provide meals for them, she would round up furniture, she would search for employment. And there was one particular family that moved in next door to her that she really went out of her way to try to help. After several months, the family, one day they were just gone. They disappeared. Perhaps they returned to New Orleans. But they left without acknowledging, without saying a single word of thanks to Alice for all of her efforts on their behalf. Just disappeared. Shortly thereafter, Alice was approached by another neighbor, another refugee, who lived a couple of houses down from there. This woman was also displaced, and she appeared at her door, knocked. Alice opens the door. She's disheveled. She's agitated. She has 2 young children in tow. And this woman wanted to know if she could borrow from Alice a long extension cord. And if she could plug into Alice's power, run the extension cord to her house until her power had been restored because it had been shut off for lack of payment. Alice hesitated. Her own utility bills were pretty hefty. Her income was limited. And she remembered that other refugee family who had departed without a word of gratitude. And so Alice told the new neighbor that she needed time to see if she could find an extension cord that was long enough, and please come back an hour from now. And then she picked up her telephone and she called her best friend, who lived a couple of blocks away. And the best friend gave her an earful. "Those people are disgusting," she said. "They have so much gall." And so Alice puts the phone back down. The young mother returns. Alice says, "Couldn't find an extension cord, and therefore I cannot be of any assistance to you." The woman looks down, mumbles, "Thank you anyway," and she retreats to her own house. But then later on, Alice reflects on her behavior. Was she punishing this particular woman because of the ingratitude of her former neighbor? Misdirected anger, we would call it. Perhaps it was typical of people in New Orleans to borrow electricity from one another when someone's power had been shut off. But try as she might, she could not settle the issue in her mind. "I could not, for the life of me, muffle my guilt," she writes. So how do we avoid rationalizations like that? How do we tap into those charitable instincts and bring them more consistently into play in our lives? Well, most obviously, it requires getting ourselves out of our comfort zone. Because if we are never in personal contact with those who, as they put it, live on the other side of the tracks, our empathy is likely to remain deeply dormant. Research shows that people who live in economically diverse areas are more generous and charitable than those who live in wealthy enclaves. And not surprisingly, those who volunteer in food pantries, homeless shelters, who tutor in the public schools, they become more aware of bodhicitta, that soft spot in their psyches. Regrettably, those who have the most to give and those who could make the greatest difference in our collective fortunes are often the least likely to exhibit agape. Because today, Americans in the top quintile of income give less than half as much of their earnings to charity as those in the bottom quintile of earners. 1.4% for the top quintile, 3.5% for the bottom quintile. Moreover, fewer donations from the wealthy are directed toward those, as it was scratched on the bowl, those who are in greatest need. Of the 50 largest individual gifts to public charities in 2012, not a single one of those 50 went to an agency that provides assistance to the poor or the dispossessed. 34 of those 50 gifts went to prestigious universities, and the remainder went to museums, medical facilities, and other institutions that cater to the nation's elite. It's the rich giving to the rich. Now, should this surprise us? Since in a recent poll of Americans' wealthiest citizens, a majority characterized poor people as lazy, unmotivated, and undeserving of outside assistance. Nikolai Berdyaev, Russian religious and political commentator, once said that the question of bread for myself, that is a material question. The question of bread for my neighbor, that is a spiritual question. Bodhicitta, charity, agape, whatever name you care to give it, that is a spiritual value, a spiritual practice, and it attests most clearly to the attention that we have given to our own spiritual lives. It is transformative. It is, as Bell Hooks observed, a way for any of us to experience salvation. Blessed be. And amen.